short answer is no. I mean, I've been living in Europe for the last 9 years, so I would identify myself as a temporary resident here. But identity-wise, I don't think I will have a strong European identity per se. Yeah. Well, even though my family is in a way have the German connection, because my wife is German, and also my child has the German passport. I think that would be a question for my future generation, basically, but not for me personally. Because I don't plan to stay in Europe for the rest of my life. So in that way, because I'm always traveling, I'm always moving around, so I would probably identify myself as a global citizen in a way. So I won't really associate myself with a strong, say, Asian identity or European identity. But a more kind of complicated answer to that is that I kind of see Europe not in a way from a strong identity perspective, because I did not really come to Europe in a way to study the European culture or study the European civilization. I think that kind of migration culture has changed fundamentally. I think 30, 40 years ago, there might be people who migrate to Europe specifically to study the German culture, French culture, or the British culture. I think for my generation is that we come to Europe because Europe is a meeting place for people from all over the world. So I come to the UK because if I want to learn anything about India, about Africa, about the other cultures, this is a place to meet those people. So the Europe becomes a meeting point. So in that sense, I identify with this kind of, in a way, cosmopolitan kind of environment, but not necessarily as a European identity. Right. I think there's two events. One is that the Iraq War, because in the Iraq War, the EU has a relatively different foreign policy in comparison to the US. And before that, I think for a lot of outsiders, we still regard Europe and the US as more or less a common entity under the category of the West. And then the divisions, in a way, on the Iraq War shows that there are actually divisions within this kind of concept of West. And the Europe has, in a way, its own kind of preference, its own value. And that really, in a way, left the impression, I think, for the outsiders, for non-Europeans, I think, at that moment, at that historical moment, basically. And I think the second moment was when the Schengen visa was introduced, because that has a huge impact on non-Europeans, and especially, I think, on the Indian and also the Chinese nationals. Because at that time, you start to have the kind of concept that once you've been granted visa by one embassy, then you can freely travel around Europe. And that is a moment when you have a lot of this kind of tools coming up, specifically saying this will be a Europe tool. And then that was the moment when people start to, in a way, in their mind, separate the UK and the rest of Europe, because the UK does not belong to the Schengen area. So I think that's because of this kind of limits on the mobility, people have, in a way, different concepts or form different concept of why Europe is a separate, is a single, is a unified entity. Brexit, without doubt, we were very shocked. I think both my wife and I. We kind of still remember that morning very clearly. That we woke up and we checked result and realized that the vote of the Brexit. And for me, as I explained before, that Europe has always been a meeting point where people can come over and meet. And for me, that was the point when, in a way, that kind of, in a way, utopia more or less collapsed. And I remember the second day, I was meeting a friend in London, and what we were talking about that time, and he was from Mexico, and what we were talking about that time is that, where is the global capital for the contemporary youth? In the 1920s, in the 1930s, that was Paris. The Americans in Paris, the Asians in Paris, the early communist generation, they're all in Paris. So Paris at that time was a global capital for the young generation. And then my Mexican friend said it was London until today because of the vote. So I think that was a shock, I think, for a lot of, in a way, foreigners who have come to London, come to UK, or come to Europe in general for that international or that cosmopolitan environment. I would still say it's probably the Schengen area. When I remember very clearly because that was the time when, in a way, I can go to one European country and then just travel around. And that was also the time because of the freedom of movement when I was doing the visa, because I was doing a resident card for Germany at that time as well. Because of the freedom of movement and because of the protection on privacy, I don't even have to review in that visa application about where I want to live in future. So I can't have a visa for Germany, but I can live in France a year later. And that kind of flexibility, that kind of mobility between sovereignty state is something I've never seen before. And I think that as a political scientist, we always say that what makes nation states is always war conflict. So if you want to unite different nation states, in the past history, it has always been conflict or war. So it's always been a bloody kind of experience in a way. But I think the European Union has successfully, in a way, created this kind of sovereignty without borders in a relatively peaceful manner. And I think that it itself is a very beautiful and also innovative thing. It gives me an international perspective. As I mentioned before, I think that if I say that's where I develop my global perspective, to be attentive to what is happening elsewhere and to be attentive of the intensity of different cultures and societies, that did not happen when I was traveling elsewhere. That happened when I was living in Europe. So although I was not traveling physically outside Europe, I can feel that the diversity of culture simply by living here. And I think that is the most important thing I think the EU or the Europe has done to me. I'm not that optimistic. So for me personally, I think if the EU can still survive by 2030 as a unified entity, it is already a success politically. And by standing there, EU itself already demonstrates an example of unifying sovereign nation states in a peaceful way. I think just by doing that, just by surviving, it can already be a good example.